Yeah, perfect.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. So today it's very exciting. We have some homegrown talent. We have Annayah M.B, who is these days is assistant professor / lecturer in the School of Management. She's in the marketing group there, but she did her undergraduate and her MRes and her PhD in this department. So she's yeah, so she's very much homegrown. She has done lots of fantastic, exciting things. She's had postdocs and research positions at a number of other universities, including Oxford and Yale. She's also done bits of consultancy and projects for a number of other organisations, including Scottish Government, BSI, Northern Ireland Government, and others. She's the Deputy Director of Bath Centre for Qualitative Research as well. She is award-winning. She has multiple awards. She has the BPS Qualitative Methods Section Citation for Doctoral Excellence Award and the Dean's Award for Research Communication and Translation last year. And, fun fact, she was interviewed about Taylor Swift live on Sky News quite recently. So she has many strings to her bow. And her work is really at the intersection, I would say, of kind of social psychology, moral psychology, political psychology, environmental psychology. So she's in a really interesting space and is a big champion for open science, as well as kind of equality, diversity in science. So she really embodies a lot of the important principles, I think, of some of the good things that we're doing. So without further ado, over to you, Annayah.
You, Lorraine.
Just before we start, we are trialling recording the seminar series, so please keep your criticism as Fiji as possible. And now.
Excellent, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm really flattered. Lorraine, you're amazing. Thank you so much. I want to cry already. That's not. So welcome everyone. Yeah, I am very much familiar with the department. So I did my undergrad here starting, I think, back in 2012, 2013. So there are a lot of old faces, a lot of new faces, but I'm sure a lot has changed in the 2 years since I've been over on the dark side in 10 East in management. So we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. But today I'm going to be talking about my work on the importance of qualitative methods for studying sustainability. Across lots of different disciplines. If this works, probably not. Sure. Yeah, okay, it's working now. All right, so a lot of you here, I see a lot of familiar faces from the ENTS group, so I'm hoping climate change is familiar to a lot of you. I'm not like the one to bring the bad news to the party. But yes, we are facing a climate and ecological emergency. In the UK and internationally. I've taken a couple of examples from the local context because people often feel that climate change is quite distant from us in terms of we don't know anyone affected by it. We might think it only affects people in countries away from us, but that's really not the case at the moment. So these are some local examples. So this is the average temperature change recorded in Bristol since sort of the 1900s up until now. Red means getting hotter, which is not so good. Some of you will remember in 2022, we had a really intense heat wave all across the UK. I did some work on that in Nottingham, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But actually, at the moment, I've moved away from Bath and I currently live in Rushden-on-Avon. And this is what the centre of our town looks like a lot of the time. So this is the town bridge. This is one of the only crossings across the River Avon in our direction. And our town floods a huge amount. So this isn't just something that affects people far away from us. It's very much happening here within the local area. And we know, based on a lot of work that people in this room and online have done, and loads of other people internationally, that this is primarily a people problem. So climate change is fundamentally anthropogenic. It's caused by people, primarily caused by carbon emissions. And there's lots and lots of evidence to suggest this. I think the figure now is like over 99% of scientists agree that it's anthropogenic in nature. So climate change is very much caused by people. Also, what we've looked at is sort of how much people believe in climate change. There's oftentimes an impression that there's people who don't believe in climate change, don't think it's real. In some of the research Lorraine and I did, that is very much not the case. A lot of the evidence suggests that most people believe in climate change and also believe it's going to impact them and their family, and they also believe that it's caused by human activity. So these are kind of things that are unequivocal. Lorraine, if I'm wrong about any of this, I will show anything to you. Getting a thumbs up from Lorraine, brilliant, okay. So where I kind of started was I looked at this massive problem and I thought, what can I, as someone who has an interest in social and moral psychology at the time, what can I do to influence how we address this problem, figure out how to positively impact? And where I started was kind of thinking about the people that are already doing the kinds of behaviour change that we want people to do. So to achieve net zero, or hopefully human drawdown, we need lots of really significant behavioural change that's going to impact the way that a lot of people live. And the good news is a lot of people are already making those changes in their lives. So we have a lot of people who forego cars, who stop flying. We have a lot of people who go vegan or go zero waste or minimalist. And these are all things that we want people to do. These are all pro-environmental things that we want people to do. So I thought we could understand a little bit more about how to get the rest of the population there by looking at the experiences and understandings of the people already doing these things. So along with Tim Kurtz, who used to be here in the department, is in sunny Australia at the moment. I'm sure it's way too hot there, but it's a lot nicer than it is here. So along with Tim Kurtz, Anna Rabinovich, who's at Sussex, I believe, and Saffron O'Neill. So Tim and Saffron were part of my supervision team. You will see all of the supervision team emerge throughout this presentation. We wrote up this sort of conceptual paper looking at these specific identities, which we called moralized minority practice identities. So these are the kinds of people who are already making a lot of change in their lives out of a perceived kind of moral understanding that it's something they should do to make the world a better place. So they adopt practices that have a moralized nature to them or a perceived moralized reasoning. They are in the minority within society. So for example, we know that in the case of veganism, which is where a lot of my work stands, about less than 5% of the total population are vegan in the UK at the moment. So 95% of people aren't vegan. These identities are centered around very specific, highly visible practices that are very difficult to hide without altering your life. So for example, if you are a vegan and you want to consistently be a vegan, it's very difficult to exist in a work or education or home space without someone else finding out that you are a vegan, unless you just forego food, in which case that's a completely different moral identity, right? And there are communities that center around these kind of groups. So we looked at conceptualizing groups in this manner, and we found that thinking about groups in this way means brings in a new conceptualization of the kind of social identity. So in traditional social identity theory, you'll have a group that people feel identified with. But what we added to that was we found that when you bring in the moral and the minority dimension, that can make life really, really difficult for people in these groups because they're constantly having to defend their behavior among other group members and people who don't identify with them. There's a lot of what we call do-gooder derogation. In this paper, which I can't go into much more now without going hugely over time already, we brought together lots of different theories to conceptualize this. And so that's kind of what started the work that we were looking at. And along the way, we did a lot of work with other people. So some of you may remember Chris Bryant, who was also a PhD student at the same time that I was. So we collaborated with him on this amazing paper looking at essentially every single barrier that vegetarians and vegans face when they're trying to change their behavior. And it is an absolutely mammoth paper. I think it ended up being about 50 pages long, very difficult to publish. But what it showed us is that for even people who are highly motivated to change by that moral intuition, it is really, really difficult. And there's lots of different barriers that they face, whether it's sort of internal barriers or external barriers from other people. So this is kind of where you get a lot of these memes of people asking why you're vegan, like why don't you miss meat, is it expensive? So change is really difficult even for those who are motivated to change. So from then on, as someone with an interest in qualitative methodologies and discursive methodologies, I wanted to try and investigate the dynamics of these groups in a slightly different way. And I came across discourse analytic perspectives. And if you want to find out a little bit more about this, me and Tim wrote this paper in Current Opinion and Psychology, going into a lot of the reasons why discursive analysis is really important for understanding the interpersonal dynamics of climate change. So this perspective sees talk as performing specific social actions. So when we talk about something, we are creating the world. We are doing the thing by talking about it. And as the paper says, these constructions function to guide groups' own sense of what's normal, what's sensible for that group. And they also guide how and why groups might attempt to persuade other non-identified members of their position. So, acknowledging that these minority groups exist in a place in society where it's very difficult for them to do their behaviour, they're constantly having to justify their behaviour to other people, we felt that traditional qualitative methods might be a little bit problematic for studying these groups. In part because the groups have to what we call engage in face saving, so the idea that they minimise their own behaviours so that they don't have as much interactional trouble, they don't get picked on by other people. It can be really easy for vegans and vegetarians and other more moralized groups to slip into a kind of defensive stance when they're asked about their behaviour. So we wanted to create a sort of safe space or, an echo chamber, I guess, for these groups to be able to talk about the reality of their group and decide together what their group meant. So the way that we did this was we attempted to isolate the groups. So some of you may know the social observation labs over there is where a lot of this work took place. Spent a lot of time there in early PhD and MRes. And what we did was we put groups in a room with only people who identified with that group identity. So we had groups of vegans, vegetarians, and flexitarians. And then they would get slides automatically come up like that with a noise. And they would use these slides to guide their own discussion. So in a traditional focus group, there is someone like me in the group as a moderator asking the questions. In this kind of focus group, that doesn't exist. The group are just managing their discussion entirely on their own. And we thought this might work. We weren't sure if this would work. We got a lot of pushback. So we started off by introducing them to the methodology. We gave them lunch to kind of get them talking and thinking about their diet. We gave them a little trial slides to make sure they understood how the methodology went. And then they sat down for 45 minutes, moving through the slides while I watched from the other side of the two-way mirror in those rooms. They're quite creepy. So we had a bunch of different groups. We had 11 focus groups in total. Some were vegan, some were vegetarian, some were flexitarian. And the main thing is that these groups, all of the groups shared one specific identity. So vegans were only in a room with vegans, vegetarians were only in a room with vegetarians. And we hope this would really illuminate some of the kind of processes behind how these groups constructed their own identities. This has already been published, and this is another one of my very long meandering methods papers, so I'm not going to go into it in full depth, but if any of you are interested in this methodology and the ethical concerns around it, please do check that out, and I'll share slides around afterwards at the end as well. So we weren't sure if this would work. We were quite scared of it because this is something that we couldn't find evidence of anyone doing in the literature. So we were kind of trusting these groups to engage with the design. We weren't really sure. But what we actually found was that it worked really, really well. And we found that these groups, as I sort of hypothesized in a qualitative sense, they talk differently when they are isolated. And they're very open once you get them to build rapport with each other. They start to really get into the nitty-gritty of what an identity is. And we found that we didn't have so much of the kind of face-saving techniques. We didn't have people getting defensive. We had people really discussing the intricacies of their identity. And participants often took the role of the moderator themselves, which I was really delighted by. That was something we were concerned wouldn't happen. And funnily enough, people know how to have a discussion with each other. This is not a novel thing. So we didn't need someone in the room. We just had this group there talking about what it meant to be vegan, vegetarian, or flexitarian. So, for example, in this vegetarian group, they start talking about like, how good of a vegetarian are you? If you eat gummy bears, should you eat gummy bears? Does that make you a terrible vegetarian because you've got gelatin in there? And this design was inspired by a lot of the conversations that I'd had with friends engaging in dietary practices in the past, where we would have these kind of open conversations amongst ourselves, but not necessarily when we were with other meat eaters. So the gummy bear discussion is one example. The vegan group in particular were fascinating for this because there's a lot of work that vegans do to kind of minimize their position around other people. So vegans have a sort of stereotype that they're quite preachy and activistic. But actually what we found here is when you get them all into a room together, that talk becomes much more overt. So here we had a really interesting discussion and quite a controversial discussion among the vegan group, where they were talking about whether it was fair or sort of morally permissible to compare animal suffering and animal slaughter to the Holocaust. And was it really fair to compare animal suffering to human suffering? One of the vegans felt absolutely that was true. One of the other vegans thought that that was absolute nonsense. And instead of sort of having an argument in the environment that we had, they were able to hash out exactly why they disagreed, what the points of disagreement were. Rona was able to say, like, I get the sentiment, I know what you're saying, but I think it's too soon. We still haven't advanced in our understanding of diversity and such. So from this, we were able to get a really great insider view into how these groups talk when they're alone and when they're together with other group members, which is really helpful for looking at how these groups differ to their sort of stereotypes around this group. So the paper that I'm working on, which formed part of my PhD, and I am trying to work out what to do with it, was looking at how these groups kind of differ on a variety of different dimensions, I guess. So one of these dimensions was when the groups were talking about boundary products. So there's kind of a bit of an assumption that dietary groups are quite strict about what they eat. So vegans don't eat meat and dairy or any animal product. Vegetarians don't eat meat and fish. And flexitarians are definitely reducing their meat consumption. What we found through this approach was that actually the boundaries were a lot less fixed. They were more flexible according to lots of different circumstances. So for example, leather came up for vegans a lot. Some of you who are vegan will already know the leather discussion. There was kind of reticence of some people to say that leather was truly bad because it's more pro-environmental than plastic alternatives, but it's still a byproduct of the industry. The vegans were also unsure about whether it was truly ethical to have a pet if you had to feed that pet meat. They were really, both vegans and vegetarians were unsure about lab-grown meat in general. So for the vegans, they said that even if it wasn't from an animal, if an animal was involved at any sort of point of the chain, it would be really bad for them to do that. We also had discussion of honey in the vegan group. And in the vegetarian group, there was a lot of discussion at the time around whether bug protein could be a potential future protein. Vegetarians had mixed feelings about this. Vegans tended to agree that bugs were not vegan, but for some vegetarians, they felt that bugs were fine, others not. And for flexitarians, some of them surprisingly saw dairy as actually worse than meat, which I didn't expect. So these kind of boundaries that we think exist according to the literature and according to, like, you know, popular media are a lot more sort of transient and transparent. So for example, here's a discussion that the vegetarian group had about bug consumption. So are you vegetarian if you eat bugs? Not strictly, you're not being strictly vegetarian. I don't have the same affinity for a bug that I do a cow. So they have more like emotions, and I feel like they're being, and then Mike comes along and says, great thing, which I think might be the title of the paper, are we making an arbitrary cutoff though between living beings? It's so arbitrary, yeah, that's where I draw the line. So there was this very blurry kind of boundary when it came to specific products, and this has kind of been theorized in the literature in terms of people having less connection to animals that don't have faces, for example. But it was really great to see this come out apropos of nothing, so that's awesome. We also had different attitudes towards the strictness of the boundaries. So for vegans, I expected them to be really strict and unforgiving, and that was actually not the case. A lot of vegans accepted that it was truly impossible to be fully vegan in a modern world, particularly, for example, like vaccines are often non-vegan. The money that we spend now has lanolin in it as a default, which is a sort of sheep byproduct, I believe. So they accepted that you kind of had to try as hard as you can, but you couldn't be perfect all the time. Vegetarians often didn't read any labels. They used very simple heuristics like, was it alive? Can it feel pain? But again, they thought that trying hard was really what matters. And the flexitarians had no clear definition at all. Some of them actually didn't even call themselves flexitarian in public, even though to get into the study, they had to tick box, say flexitarian. So, yeah, and here's an example of the talk around flexibility. This is from one of the flexitarian groups saying, it's more the point of flexitarianism. It's not a process towards something, we're choosing to be flexible. Like, I want to have the flexibility. I like to bake. I want to do these things. So it was a lot more situational. And then before I move on, I'm just going to talk very quickly about activism. So activism was really, really important for the vegan identity and a lot less important for other people, for the vegetarians and flexitarians. So for some of the vegans, they felt that you weren't truly vegan unless you had an activist stance and you engaged in vegan activism. Others disagreed with this, but everyone in the vegan groups kind of engaged in some form of activism. Vegetarians and flexitarians tended to stay away from this activistic stuff. So for example, here's a quote demonstrating the strength of the sort of vegan feeling towards this. So I probably can't swear, but you guys can read this and anyone online, like watching the documentaries going, this is the reality, this is what unites us as vegans. We not only are aware of and understand the horror, but we're also willing to do something about it. And the thing that was really special for me about this data is that if you're interviewing or moderating a traditional focus group, you can kind of work so hard to get this kind of data out of people. So just to see it come up without any of that interaction, just as a product of the environment that we cultivated, yeah, was really awesome and really special, and that was a great success. And then COVID happened, and I couldn't use this methodology for a long time, so that was good. Another example of how we've used this methodology in a different context was our study looking at how vegans and vegetarians interact with meat eaters at the table. So it was a very similar design. Apart from in this situation, we always had vegans and vegetarians in the minority. So there'd be, I think, between 2 and 3 vegans and vegetarians alongside 4 or 5 meat eaters. And then we would get them to have a conversation to try and see if there were many differences around the discussions had. So from this perspective, we used a kind of discursive approach, like I talked about at the beginning, and we had a quite big sample for this. This was quite an undertaking. This has also recently been published in Qualitative Research in Psychology and was led by Marika Fordonnell, who I don't think is here, but is part of the clinical program, or I think has just graduated from the clinical program after doing a PhD as well. So Marika is amazing. And this was something that she led on. And going back to the beginning, from this evidence, we found that talking about veganism is really difficult when you're in an intergroup context. So contrary to the sort of popular opinion that vegans are very preachy, we found that vegans downplayed the moral motivations for their diet to avoid this kind of interactional adventure. And they also did a kind of weird thing where they performed continued liking of meat. So they would talk about how much they liked the taste or the smell of meat. And in situations where they did disclose their morality and their dislike of meat, we saw conversations stall. So I'm not going to go into this quite too much, but you can see from the pauses, there's a 4-second pause. Down here, the vegan says, so stressful, looks down, 8-second pause before everyone moves on. So these conversations are very, very difficult on this. I think I messed that up. Sure. Yeah, that works. Okay, that's working now. That's fine. Great. So, of course, the focus groups are really great, but they are things that happen within a very controlled environment, a very contrived environment. So for the next part of my PhD, I wanted to kind of get out into the real world and find out if there was any circumstance where vegans could experience a similar environment to the ones we cultivated in the focus groups in real life, and to see what experiencing that, what we call identity centering event, does for them and their identities. So this is where Lorraine joined the team, which is great. A little picture there. So I went to the vegan campout. Are any of you familiar with this event? No? So it is one of the world's largest vegan gatherings. So it's a whole weekend event. It's kind of like a festival. There's no sort of requirement for you to be vegan to attend, but everyone that performs and every single food vendor and every single seller is vegan. So it's a vegan environment, but it's not an exclusively vegan environment, if that makes sense. So we went to this event and we wanted to find out what going to an event like this, where vegans were suddenly in the societal, well, in the event majority, what that did for their social psychology. And what we found actually was that these events were really important. So these were qualitative field interviews that I conducted with some research assistants. And we found that kind of experiencing this social majority was really helpful for vegans to kind of recharge and restore their identity. It helped them to build social networks. It built their psychological connection to the group, and it inspired a lot of them to go further in their action and activism. Now, if any of you have been to an academic conference, you may have experienced a similar effect to this. Or if you've been to a conference where people are not from your discipline or area, you might have seen this happen and been very intimidated from the outside. So this is a sort of process that I'm looking into a little bit more now, but this is sort of where it all started. Okay. So in the last sort of few minutes of my talk, I'm going to wax lyrical about qualitative methods, because that's kind of my thing. I am a mixed methods researcher. I have published using a lot of different methods, including neuroscience. My first academic position was actually working on electric shock studies. So I've gone from the extremely quantitative all the way over to sort of fieldwork, ethnographic, qualitative. And what surprised me is that qualitative methods can have really, really dramatic impacts, particularly in the policy space. So I mentioned that I did my PhD during COVID. I started my PhD in October 2019. And then a few months later, everything went really bad. So to kind of fill the gap where I was trying to work out how to reposition my PhD, I engaged in a policy placement, which was funded by the SWDTP. So if there's any PhD students, you should definitely do that. It's really, really cool. And it was working with the all-party parliamentary group on the Green New Deal to try and see if there was anything from COVID that we could apply to creating wider changes to make society more environmentally sustainable. And from this, I actually realized how important it is to have qualitative evidence, particularly when you're trying to speak to non-academics or policymakers. And we ran a bunch of focus groups, we ran a bunch of interviews with people about their experiences of COVID. And this quote has, like, I think about this quote, I feel like once a day. Ever since I've done this, this is just the most amazing quote about this person who was working from home. And they said that one labourer in our workshop put it, "I can't mix cement in my front room, now can I?" It's like qualitative research has such a way of like taking really complex things and distilling them into a sentence. So we put together two reports. One of them was a research report and one of them was a policy report. Try to get the government to do something. That's maybe another talk because that didn't work so well. Here's another example of how we use qualitative research in that report. So we had a really cool digital ethnographer look at how people were using humour in lots of different social network groups to try and cope with the pandemic. And we also got lots of different people around Britain to talk about their hopes for post-coronavirus Britain. Another example of qualitative research having a really cool impact is this project led by Charles. I'm not going to go into this too much because I think Charles is coming in a couple of weeks, right? You all have to go to his talk. Charles is amazing. He's a really, really cool researcher who's done a lot of great work engaging with communities. And I worked very briefly with him on a postdoc at Nottingham, looking at experiences of the 2022 heat wave. And there were just a lot of really intense experiences that people had. People felt like their health was at risk, their physical health, their mental health, lots and lots of different things. So this is just kind of an advertising for Charles's talk. You should all go for that. So One of the things I really value about qualitative research is the orientation that it has towards depth and validity and explanation. And I find it really valuable when you're trying to gain a picture of how a community functions, how that community experiences the world, or how specific places or peoples or identity groups are impacted by specific things. And I also think qualitative research is really important for contextualizing quantitative findings, particularly in sort of policy engagement space where, you know, academics may feel that the quantitative evidence is more rigorous, but when you go to a policymaker, they don't necessarily have the sort of statistical knowledge that you do. So having sort of even a line or even one quote of qualitative research to back up your quantitative findings can really, really, really help in policy context. Yet, despite the value of qualitative methods, it is hugely underrepresented in environmental psychology research, and I think in psychology at large as well. So based on some research that came out in 2014, in a survey of environmental psychologists, only 7% of recently conducted studies were qualitative in design. And that's also very similar in the published literature. Some of you may be aware of this controversy that happened recently, where the Journal of Environmental Psychology said that they would not accept qualitative methods. They have not accepted qual for quite a long time. I think they used to publish a lot of qualitative research. They stopped doing it, and then they released this editorial which explicitly said that they wouldn't publish qualitative research. A lot of people had a lot of things to say about that, not many good things, and we're currently writing up a chapter kind of summarizing this debate and what we can learn from it. That is no longer the case, so everyone try and submit your qualitative research to the Journal of Environmental Psychology and let me know how you get on. Because I do worry that even though the position has changed, that might not actually be reflected in the editorial process. And this kind of links to a lot of sort of activism and advocacy I've been doing on open qualitative research. And there are a lot of changes that have been introduced to the way that we do research based on perceived crisis in quantitative methods. So most of you are psychologists, you'll have heard of the reproducibility crisis, the trust crisis, the lots and lots of different crises that have happened. I was sort of starting my career while those crises were happening, so a lot has already changed. We didn't used to have open data, we didn't used to have preprints, we didn't used to have any of these things. But the problem that I and other researchers who may be in the room and online, these are some of the folks that I've worked with in this department on this. So there's Rich, Joanna, Ralph, and Nina, among lots of other people as well. We're a little bit concerned that when these changes are not applied inclusively to qualitative methods, that can actually really harm qualitative research and reduce the ethics and rigor of those approaches. So I'm continuing this work over in management. Management actually is even worse than psychology when it comes to openness and transparency. And in the quantitative domain, they're only just getting started with their reproducibility crises things. So it's very interesting to be over there. It's quite stressful. And my position is basically that we can't just copy and paste changes from quantitative research to qualitative methods without devaluing qualitative contribution. So again, another advertisement, because I am in marketing now. If you're more interested in this, I don't have time to go into it today, but we have an upcoming event next week and towards the end of the month as well, we're going to explore this a bit more. So drawing to a conclusion, I think I was reflecting on my PhD journey and the advice I have for young scholars. And I think what's been central for me throughout is that interdisciplinarity has been kind of a survival strategy almost. And I think this is especially true for qualitative scholars, where it may feel like qualitative research is not valued in psychology. There are other disciplines that very much do value qualitative research. And engaging with and going between those disciplines can be really, really helpful for anyone that feels kind of marginalized within psychology. But I think there's also a wider conversation that we need to have about how can we create space for qualitative research to thrive within psychology, and how can we form that within our departments and within our small research groups. And I think what's been most important for me is kind of trying to foster a culture of intellectual humility and curiosity. So a lot of, Lorraine said at the beginning that my work kind of broadly fits with environmental psychology, political psychology, social psychology. But since I finished my PhD, that's been broadening out even further. So these are some of the domains that I'm regularly reading and drawing from. Some of you may already be aware, hopefully, of ENTS, which is our interdisciplinary research group. I'd really encourage you to join that. And I've also been working on trying to communicate across disciplinary boundaries and also to the public as well. So there's some sort of things that you can look into a bit more. And finally, my biggest piece of advice for young scholars, for early career researchers, is that collaboration is really key, and collaboration can come from lots of different avenues. So with a bunch of other ECRs, some of whom are in the room, we edited in 2023, which, oh gosh, that is quite a while ago. We edited a special issue of The Psychologist, talking specifically about early career researchers. I'm currently editing a special issue in the British Journal of Social Psychology, looking at future social psychology. I think most of the papers from that are out soon, so our editorial should be coming out. And I also looked way back to the beginning of my career and found that I actually wrote an essay on the importance of collaboration for addressing inequalities. So you can check that out too. I will share all of these. And we're doing a lot of stuff moving onwards. I'm continuing to look at research in sort of meat consumption. I'm broadening that out to sort of festival experiences in general. I'm looking at climate communication. And we are also looking at using games to sort of help people understand climate change. So if any of you are interested in that, we have a workshop coming up that I will distribute the stuff for. And just a shout out that I now have a couple of PhD students on my own that I'm supporting as part of the team. So Holly has just started and can't be here today, I don't think. But she's doing some really cool work on looking at climate change impacts with people with disabilities, and Sarah, who is over there, is doing even more cool work on communicating and promoting flight-free holidays. So definitely reach out to them and ask them what they're doing as well. Okay, that is everything. Thank you very much. That
was fantastic, Annayah, and lots of sources of inspiration there as well. So we've got 10 minutes, I think, or so for questions. So shall we start in the room? Does anybody have a question